much, Christina. Thank you for the kind introduction and all the incredible behind the scenes work that you're doing with us and all the various studies. So just really appreciate all that you're doing for us. So let's just get started. As you can see, we're going to be discussing implementation of a brain-computer interface targeting working memory in adults with mild cognitive impairment. And so I'm privileged to be an associate clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry, also work at the VA, where I see patients in a psychosis clinic. And I'm also a co-founder of BioSignal Solutions, LLC, which is a private company. Let me see if I can, here we go. Okay, so this is just a schematic for us to start thinking about what the term BCI or brain-computer interface represents. So basically, it's a system that can acquire brain signals, analyze those signals, and then output them into some sort of an actionable command. So I think these are some of the most key elements here. The output has to be something that is actionable, so it cannot be something super complicated. That's an important part to keep in mind. There are some examples of successful use of BCI, and these have mostly been done in neuromuscular disorders, things like ALS, some stroke patients. And there, in some ways, what the BCI does is it replaces neural pathways that no longer exist, either due to disease generally, or maybe some sort of neurodevelopmental problem. When we talk about BCI in the realm of neuropsychiatric disorders, it's different because what we're thinking about doing is mostly improving existing pathways. That's potentially one way of getting the brain to work better. But I think another really interesting possibility is that we may perhaps be tapping into other intact pathways, or even creating new pathways or strategies for the brain to be able to do that work that we are asking it to do. So I think that's a pretty fundamental difference between sort of the neurologic disorder implementation of BCI versus what we're trying to do in the realm of neuropsychiatric disorders. And some of the power of BCI really comes from that flexibility. Now, I'll specifically talk to you today about neurofeedback, EEG neurofeedback, which is a form of BCI implementation. And as you can see here in this schematic, you have an individual sitting with EEG electrodes over their scalp, recording brain activity. This is just a picture of the electrodes. And that activity can be then recorded using a computer. You can take a look at the data, pull out some sort of a feature from that data that's of interest, and then use that information to provide feedback. And the signal usually in these types of setups is either a yes or a no. So if this brain feature meets some kind of threshold that's been specified and the signal is yes, then the game will progress. Here's a snowboarder who's going down a track, and so he'll be able to keep going. If brain activity does not meet that pre-specified condition, then the response of the system is no, in which case feedback will not be provided, and this individual will not progress in the game. And so then that basically sets up a loop, right? Because let's say the person receives feedback, yes, you're doing great, your brain is doing what it should be doing. They can keep doing it, try to maintain that, maybe gain more points, progress in the application. On the other hand, if the signal is no and the feedback they're getting is what you're doing isn't working, you need to try something different, they can try to shift their brain state, which then will hopefully lead to the expected change and help them go back into that activity and provide positive feedback. So this is what neurofeedback looks like when you're doing it using an EEG system. So one of the things we wanted to do in my lab, and you can see the name of the lab Christina mentioned here, functional neuroscience, we're really very interested in targeting activity that is highly clearly related to everyday functioning for individuals. And in this particular instance, working memory is a really fantastic target, because it's something that we all rely on very heavily for our daily functioning. It's a short-term memory, and it is a fluid and flexible space. It's a space where we can manipulate, change, analyze information, and have it readily available to guide our daily activities. It does have a limited capacity, so that's another interesting aspect of this type of memory. I have these two images here to remind myself to share some examples. I think all of us, this is an old school telephone before we had smartphones where we could save everybody's phone number easily. If you needed to make a call to someone and someone had told you their phone number 5 minutes ago, you had to kind of check in with your brain and say, okay, wait a minute, what was that number? 858-922, blah, blah, and then go dial it. So that type of brain space where we're trying to hold that information is an example of working memory. Another would be if you're working in the kitchen and you're making something, there's some ingredients in the recipe you don't have, or you decide to make twice as much or half as much. All those quick changes, computations that you need to do in order to be able to implement the recipe could also fall under working memory. And interestingly, it turns out that working memory impairments are fairly common in a number of neuropsychiatric disorders, including schizophrenia. And definitely Alzheimer's disorder is one where this is the hallmark of the illness. I'll talk just a little bit about impairments in schizophrenia because that's sort of where I started. Clinically, that's my area, and it's an interesting disorder where people can have all kinds of positive symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, etc., negative symptoms like difficulty communicating, apathy, things like that. But what seems to truly impact an individual's ability to function in their daily lives actually turns out to be cognitive deficits. And working memory is an especially important aspect of that category, which is affected in folks with schizophrenia. And as I mentioned, in Alzheimer's disorder, that's the hallmark of the illness, is loss of short-term memory, especially working memory. And we see this really playing out in poor community functioning. There are lots of relationships described between working memory and employment success, for example, success in school, relationships, etc. And so we wanted to assess the potential of this particular entity as a treatment target. And so the first thing you really need to do if you're going to implement it using a BCI is we're going to have to find some kind of a viable neurosignature. So for that, in order to gain some understanding of that, then we needed to go back to the brain and start looking at neuroanatomy and trying to piece together what we know about the neural correlates of working memory. The DLPFC, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is a very special part of the brain that seems to be highly implicated in important executive function. For example, It's the part of the brain that we need in order to make good long-term decisions. It is also a part of the brain that is involved in working memory and attention and other types of memory. In terms of what we know about the neurons in that area, is that there is a local microcircuit that exists between two sets of neurons, the parvalbumin positive GABA interneurons and the excitatory pyramidal cells. And so what happens between these two cells is that activity from one set of neurons affects activity from the other. Increases in excitation lead to increases in inhibition, which then feeds back the excitation and again sets up this local microcircuit, which actually leads to electrical fluctuations that are big enough to be detected on the scalp. And these can be seen in the form of gamma oscillations over frontal cortical areas. F3, F4, I think are ones that have been studied well, but some of the other areas as well, more anterior areas, pick up gamma oscillations as well. And so here is a part of the brain, the DLPFC, which is important, which is necessary for adequate cognitive function, which appears to largely rely on a local microcircuit between interneurons and excitatory neurons that works in a way that leads to large frontal gamma oscillations that can be detected using an EEG, for instance. So then perhaps those frontal gamma oscillations could serve as a neurosignature of working memory or other cognitive function. And this could then be strengthened. If we can measure this activity, then perhaps we can find ways of strengthening it. And neurofeedback BCI is one of those that I'm going to talk about today. But others have used strategies such as entrainment. TMS has been used, and I think more recently, direct current stimulation has also demonstrated some promise in modulating gamma oscillations. And so then here is an updated image of that BCI that we talked about earlier. Instead of using those wet electrodes, there have been a lot of innovations, and we're now able to use dry EEG electrode headsets that look something like this. This one has 20 channels that usually is used for testing, not so much for EEG neurofeedback, because it's bulky for that purpose. But you can use this in conjunction with a laptop computer to collect brain data pretty easily. Then that data has to be cleaned and extracted in order to capture the neurosignature of interest. And once again, you can then feed back that information using a visual metaphor. I used the same one from my previous slide, but as you can imagine, there are lots of different possibilities for what could be done here. In our case, the signal is still a yes or no signal, although I suppose a more sophisticated system in the future could be graded so that it wasn't necessarily just a yes or no signal, but maybe there were more options, and the signal could be modulated to provide better feedback. So this is what the system looks like in the lab, roughly. And so the purpose then was, what we wanted to do in this step was to, first of all, create a BCI to reinforce those frontal gamma oscillations that I talked about and coherent activity between them using EEG neurofeedback. We needed to see if this is feasible Is it something that's well tolerated? We hypothesized that there would be improved gamma coherence, which is what we're training, and potentially improvement on working memory tasks, and hopefully some sort of correlation between change in that brain activity and the behavioral metrics that we're collecting. So I'm going to focus mostly on the top 4 aspects of this project here today. Performance on working memory tasks and correlations are all pending because the studies are currently ongoing, and so those data are not available for us to examine at this point. Let me just check and see, are there any questions from anyone at this point? Okay, then in that case, I will continue. All right, so for the study in MCI, we're enrolling adults with mild cognitive impairment defined as a clinical dementia rating score of 0.5. And there are a number of exclusions. So the individual cannot have any other forms of dementia, no stroke in the last 2 years, no history of CNS tumors or cancer in the last 2 years. And essentially, if there's any other causes, known causes of cognitive impairment, that would be an exclusion. Inclusion criteria, essentially all adults with MCI were able to verify and obtain information on the CDR of a 0.5. And so here then, the questions could be, are we able to acutely improve working memory? Are we able to slow down decline? Or are we able to, in fact, slow down conversion to Alzheimer's disease? So those are some of the overarching big questions that we're asking in that study. And the way we're implementing the EEG neurofeedback is subjects come to the lab twice a week for 12 weeks. We obtain data testing before beginning treatment every 4 weeks during the treatment, at 16 weeks, which is a month after the end of treatment, and then 2 months subsequently after that as well. And so subjects are randomized to either the treated group or a placebo group. We're anticipating about 112 up to 31 at this point towards the end of year 1.5 of the study. The placebo is another interesting question and an issue I think worth mentioning here. There are lots of different ways of having a placebo in a study like this. You could have an active placebo, meaning you could train a different part of the brain using the same methodology. You could train the same part of the brain to a different frequency instead of gamma. For instance, one could use a delta or an alpha frequency. Or the other possibility is to have a placebo where the individual is shown something on the screen. They have the experience of feedback and progression, but it's not related to their own brain activity. So after careful consideration and a great deal of back and forth, in the end, what we decided was that we needed a placebo that was not dependent, was not going to be leveraging brain activity in any way in order to have a clean placebo. And so what the individual sees in that condition is a pre-recorded session of neurofeedback that was done by someone else. So they get the feeling of change and progression, but they're not receiving any data based on their brain's activity in this case. And so then we go ahead and assess brain and behavioral outcomes. And so here's just a recording of a single session. So sessions are implemented for 30 minutes. It's a subjects come in and they do brain work for about 15 minutes, have a 5-minute break, and then they do another 15 minutes. And so, as I mentioned, gamma coherence is the target. And in this individual, this is from a single individual. And what you can see is they come in, and there's a certain brain state, and they start working, and you see an improvement in gamma coherence over time. And then at the 15-minute mark, they go take a break for about 5 minutes and come back, and they seem to start at a baseline that's higher than when they came in. You do get some decrease in coherence, but generally it's a little higher than the baseline. And this is what it looks like on the computer over time. And here's a close-up of the zeros and ones where feedback was given and where feedback was not given. Okay, go back. So this is data from, here, I can't see the top of this. Christina, this is the schizophrenia data or the MCI?
It says MCI.
MCI, okay. So yeah, so let me, oh wait, right, R1. This is data from 5 individuals that had MCI and underwent training with us and have completed the training. And each of these graphs represents a single 30-minute session. And so there's 24 of them over 12 weeks. And so again, the individual comes in, they do their 15 minutes. I put this in here just as a visual reminder, there's a break, and then they go back and finish out the next 15 minutes. So these are people that were in the active group, and this was done in order to check and make sure that the BCI is actually doing what it should be doing, and in fact, providing viable signal to the brain. And so one of the interesting things that we saw, if you look at each training session, is again what I mentioned earlier in that first graph. There's some kind of an increase generally at the 15-minute mark after the person has had a rest. And so we see that through most of these sessions. And the other thing which was remarkable is that somewhere kind of towards the 12th session or so, we tend to see marked increases in the baseline, the starting baseline of when those individuals come in and start their training. And this, it goes up and down a little bit, but for the most part, this change persists over time, all the way out to 24 weeks. And just for comparison, and because we have the data, I'm going to share here with you the schizophrenia data. This is in 6 individuals with schizophrenia undergoing a similar 12-week training protocol. And again, what you can see is there's this spike in gamma coherence at the 15-minute mark within each session. And then over time, you sort of see this pretty marked shift in baseline somewhere around the 10th, 12th session or so, which persists over time. Here, I think the 15-minute, post-rest spike is pretty, it's even more clear than in the MCI data. So this is what we know so far, that in fact, if you provide the brain with information on what their coherence is doing, that the brain is then able to modulate and change that activity both during the session and then also over time. So then here is some more data, just plotting out as a group. We have 6 individuals with schizophrenia and 5 with MCI, and each of these folks were in the active group. And what you're seeing here is, as a group, what they did with their gamma coherence over time, over the course of those 24 sessions. And so both of these populations increased their activity. Now, this is another graph to help us sort of see what is going on in the placebo group, because that's the other important question. Not only is it enough to show that gamma coherence is actually changing and increasing as expected in the treated group, but we also need to make sure that the placebo group isn't having any systematic changes, because otherwise that would be problematic. I see something here in the chat. Can you please speculate what it is about the break that causes the post-rest increase in coherence? Thank you. What a great question. We have some ideas. I mean, I think, you know, the analogy of exercise really fits here well in a way. And I say that because if you're in the gym and you're lifting weights, it's not uncommon when you take a break and sort of let those systems reset, you're able to start at a higher baseline. You're able to do something, lift higher than you would have been had you just kept going. So my guess is that I think with all kinds of learning, there is a sort of effect where rest is very important. Rest is very helpful. Something about that 15-minute mark, you know, we thought about the idea of maybe it needs to be every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, but we sort of came up with what we thought was a happy medium of enough of a break, but not too much of a break, because you do need to push the brain to work, but then it's nice to have that little bit of a rest, I think. And it's possible that, again, what we're hoping for is a training effect, right? So if people have been struggling, trying those first 15 minutes and they have a rest, when they come back, it's like they have some idea, they have some notion on a strategy that's working that they're able to implement much more quickly versus when they first start at the beginning of the session. So yeah, thank you for that great question. But let me go back to this graph, because I think the question of whether the placebo is having any systematic changes is also very important for us to parse out at this point. Again, this is data from a very limited number of folks because it's a quality check data. So we're not going to go check in every subject. So 5 people with MCI and 6 people with schizophrenia. And what you're seeing here is the difference score, average difference per session between gamma coherence in the active minus the placebo group. So for instance, each of these dots then represents the difference between what the coherence was in the active group minus the placebo group for that session. And over time, you're seeing an increase in that difference, which would imply then that the placebo group is a flat line and the active group is increasing. And so then what that would mean is that, in fact, the training is exclusively affecting folks in the active treatment group. And we see the same thing in both the schizophrenia and the MCI populations. And so that was very important for us to make sure that the BCI is, in fact, working the way we thought it was. So I think we feel confident that we have a functional brain-computer interface that is able to affect gamma coherence over time. And I think we're really excited about the intra-session changes, as the questioner here also wondered, on gamma coherence. There's some interesting learning effects that we're seeing that happen right at the end of a break and the start of a new session. We're glad to see that the placebo group, in fact, does not show any evidence of operant conditioning from what we can see, and that these expected changes in gamma coherence, I think, set us up hopefully for a successful study going forward. So at this point, then, we're continuing enrollment and data collection, hope to reach 112. We're going to continue to monitor BCI fidelity pretty closely. Still working to refine those EEG data, cleaning pipelines to make sure that we get high quality data. And potentially at some point, we're going to try to find ways of implementing this at scale and treat earlier stages of disease, and continue to characterize effects on real world functioning. And so there are a lot of people involved with these various projects, Professor Pineda, Dr. Granholm, Dr. Shu on the schizophrenia project, my graduate student, Yayu Lin, as well on the MCI project. Again, we have some of the same folks, Dr. Granholm, Dr. Shu, Dr. Mark Bondi, Dr. Edlin, and Dr. David Salmon from the ADRC, and a number of my research assistants and students and volunteers over the years, without whose help the project could not be completed. And here's a picture of some of us that were able to make it there. Not everybody. Yeah, so thank you. Please feel free to share any comments or questions that come to mind.